Thank you all for coming, and welcome to the Heritage Foundation for those live streaming. Sex has become cheap. That's the argument of sociologist Mark Regnerus. And today he'll share his findings with us from his recent research on the transformation of men, marriage, and monogamy, recently published by Oxford University Press. After conducting over 100 in-depth in-person interviews and analyzing multiple large nationally representative data sets, Professor Regnerus brings the best of both qualitative and quantitative analysis to explain what has changed in the modern world as a result of three technological developments: the pill, video pornography, and online dating. Together, he argues, they drive down the cost of real sex, they separate sex from dating and marriage, and in turn slow down the development of love, making fidelity more challenging, sexual malleability more common, and have taken a toll on men's marriageability. So joining us today are Mark Regnerus and Catherine Jean Lopez. Professor Regnerus is a professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin and a senior fellow at the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. His research is in the areas of sexual behavior and family, marriage, and religion. He's the author of over 40 published articles and book chapters and 3 scholarly books. His previous books include Premarital Sex in America: How Young Americans Meet, Mate, and Think About Marrying, from Oxford back in 2011. That describes the norms, behaviors, and mating market realities facing young adults. And then prior to that, Forbidden Fruit: Sex and Religion in the Lives of American Teenagers, published in 2007 from Oxford University Press. And that book tells the story of how religion does and does not shape teenagers' sexual decision-making. Interviewing him today is Catherine Jean Lopez. She's a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, where she directs the Center for Religion, Culture, and Civil Society, and she's the editor-at-large at National Review. She's also a nationally syndicated columnist and has been published in a wide variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Stars and Stripes, the National Catholic Register, and First Things. Among other honors, last year she was awarded the annual Washington Women in Journalism Award for Outstanding Journalism from CQ Roll Call for her writing about religious persecution and genocide against Christians in the Middle East. A product of New York City Catholic schools, she serves on a number of Catholic boards and is a member of Cardinal Timothy Dolan's Pro-Life Commission. We're pleased to have the National Review Institute co-sponsor this event with us. I asked you to just quickly check to make sure your cell phone is off or at least silent, and then please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Regnerus and Catherine Jean Lopez.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Mark, I'm going to start with the obvious, what seems to be the obvious question. How on earth and why on earth would you publish a book with Oxford University Press called Cheap Sex? I think I'll confess how many emails we went around trying not to name this event Cheap Sex.
Well, the idea struck me, the title struck me 5 or 6 years ago when I first started working on this book. And I got detoured for several years, and then when I got back to the content, sometimes I just sort of think about titles, and that one came to me. And I thought, well, if the data holds, I'll leave the title as is. And throughout that process, well, yeah, I think that title still fits, so I left it, and they took it. So.
And does it worry you that it might sort of make everything seem a little crasser than you want it to? And of course, the main takeaway, the main point you're trying to make is this market point. Can you talk a little bit about that and why it's a realistic thing to look at, and it's not demeaning an already bad situation?
Correct. I mean, one could say the situation is already crass. I'm just naming what's out there. And I didn't, there's plenty of books published on sex and sexual relationships with much more of a focus on relational dynamics, intimacy, faith perspectives, things like that, and that's not my domain. So when I say cheap, part of the reason I say that is because I approach this from an exchange relationship perspective. And why do I do that? Well, that started 7 or 8 or 9 years ago when I read a piece by Roy Baumeister, social psychologist from Florida State. I was on a trip on a way to visit him and some other folks in a study of social self-control, right? I was like, okay, I got to look up this Baumeister guy. And I honed in on this piece, and I read it on the airplane ride, and it just was like, wow. It just, you could start to see it all around you. It was kind of a framework shift for me. So I was already getting into the study of relationship decision-making, and so I just started asking people questions, interviewees, around, and this was in the book, the second book on premarital sex. And I saw that there was clearly this mating market developing, and then integrated the thoughts of Tim Reichert, who had written Bitter Pill for First Things. That was another kind of one of those handful of pieces you read, and it just kind of changes the way I'm seeing things afterwards. It redirected me to focus on sort of what's going on in the mating pool in general. And being a social scientist or sociologist, we're interested in sort of contextual things, stuff that people can't see, things that have unintended consequences. So I'm reading about this and thinking, yeah, the mating pool doesn't operate like it kind of used to. Why is that? And Reichert makes this point that the injection of artificial contraception, not just that it exists, but that it's uptaken and that it gets taken up into the mind as well. And it alters how people think about fertility and then downstream how they think about sex and their relationships. And it became obvious to me that over a period of time, as this gets uptaken, it kind of fractures the mating market, which people can't see, right, into distinctive corners. Corners that are for short-term partnering, and a corner that's for long-term partnering, ideally marriage. And then in the middle is this kind of mishmash of it's not the one thing, but it's not the other thing. And then I looked at that and I thought, does that represent people's interests? And then you saw like, oh, men kind of gravitate towards the short-term relationship thing, as they always have since time immemorial. Women gravitate more towards the other corner, the committed relationships, marriage corner. And so then you've got power differences that start to play. And if men are outnumbered by women in the marriage corner of the market, that means they're going to have more power in how it happens. Same thing in the other side. Like if men vastly outnumber women in the short-term relationship market, it means women call all the shots over there, which is true, largely speaking. So, and people hadn't written this stuff down. I feel like in the domain I work in, there's so much low-hanging fruit. I'm not sure if it's people are scared to pick up and grab the apple and talk about it, or if they can't see it, or if they dispute it. I mean, it's very sensitive stuff. You can't write this and not make great friends and bitter enemies. It's just, people are invested in the things that have created the challenges that the mating market is witnessing.
You raised the question of can people not see it or they're afraid to see it. These are not, as you point out, it isn't the most popular thing for you to be talking about, and you know well how easily caricatured your research can become. So much of the commentary around some of your research in previous books, and I'm already seeing when I Google this one as well, is sort of based on an impression of what your argument must be.
Exactly.
Because as soon as you start talking about contraception, and people just sort of assume that you're it's another religious conservative who's slut-shaming, as the phrase keeps going. Mm-hmm. Why is that unfair, and why would it do us all a service if we went a few steps into your book? Right. And why is it worth doing when it's going to win you many enemies.
Right. Well, it's worth doing because it's real and it's true and it's an accurate picture of what's going on out there. Not accurate for everybody. I mean, there are plenty of people who don't feel the kind of bluntest aspects of the mating market. There are people who sort of look like they're winners, right? You know, they won the genetic lottery and they won the mating market lottery, and we look at them as sort of ideal types that we can too model. But I mean, the mating market in general, the way it is arranged today, breaks a lot of people and depresses people and confuses people, and so it is unfortunate that people characterize the stuff I've written negatively by honing in on something they can see written about it in a magazine or by a critic, etc., and not plow into the book. I mean, I recognize people's time is limited, and I can't say to everybody, "Hey, read the book." Well, they don't have time to read 215 pages. All they get is what they'll see online. But that's unfortunate because in it, I think you'll see a very nuanced treatment of the subject. There is no slut shaming. I mean, why would I ever dream of doing something like that, right? And people think I'm characterizing all men as cads and only motivated by sex. And again, there's no evidence for me saying this kind of stuff. It's remarkable that there's this figure where you have the new mating market, and you say there's more men over in this corner and more women over in this corner, and all of a sudden that becomes me calling women only interested in marriage, or men sex-driven maniacs, which is just not fair. But then, I'm used to dealing in not fair in this domain.
Well, is there a danger too that by talking about women as the gatekeepers and how things have changed, there's like this false nostalgia that we fall into?
Right. I mean, I try to
leaning on your
dismiss
research.
nostalgia in the book. I said I'm not hearkening back to some bygone era. That's not going to happen, right? I mean, but there are people who sort of think, well, what is he up to? What is he trying to plot? And it's hard for them to accept that I'm not plotting anything. I'm trying to give a best explanation for the world we're witnessing. But that bugs people. So.
Well, is there something bigger going on here that you're trying to do, sort of recovering sociology and
Oh dear, gosh, that's a lost cause. There is no recovering sociology. I mean, in some ways, its best job is to describe richly what's going on in the social world, but I don't think we're doing that very, very well lately. And it's funny because here I'm offering this explanation around what has shaped and altered the mating market, and the marriage market in particular. But I'm not dismissive of alternative explanations. I'm saying this one isn't considered very often, right? I mean, people have been saying, oh, it's about men's wages, it's been about men's wages, etc. And I'm perfectly willing to say, yes, for a very long time, it has, the more money men made, the more confident they felt they were in marrying, and women still see men's wages as a indicator of their marriageability, even if women don't really need that money anymore, and that's a significant thing. But I'm not dismissive of arguments that make sense, but I am claiming that this one is underestimated, under-theorized, and we're starting to see less evidence of this sort of the men's wages things. So since the book came out, there's this fascinating National Bureau of Economic Research paper on wage increase in North Dakota during the fracking boom. They said they compared it to the coal boom, I think it was in the 70s and 80s. In West Virginia, you saw marriage rates rise in step with men's wages. Same thing does not happen in the fracking boom, right? And I know there's good money to be made, even as I forget what they call those, roughnecks, right? there's good money to be made as a roughneck, but it wasn't translating into, it translated into more fertility, but it didn't translate into marriage in North Dakota. And that's kind of surprised these economists because it should, right? So I'm not against those explanations, but if they're not working anymore, and that's one piece of evidence against it, well, what is going on in the marriage market and why doesn't that work anymore? And this is kind of an explanation that says, hey, people are underestimating that men who have ready access to sex and don't have to pay much for it, so to speak, in terms of their resources, commitment, pledges of monogamy, good treatment, unless they're socially pressured to do so, they may not.
So is there any way of reversing this trend? You quote at some point, I think the number was a third of the men and women in their 20s will never get married.
Yeah, that's a projection. Some people think he's, too pessimistic. This is from Stephen Ruggles. He was the former head of the Population Association of America. He said it's historically been about 8 to 10% of the population did not marry. And now he thinks the people who are in their 20s now, a third of them will not marry, which is a huge surge, right? And then to suggest that they aren't marrying because they don't want to would be, a ridiculous leap to make. So is it reversible? I don't see how, at least not at the present. I mean, which is ironic given that people criticize me for wanting to reverse things. Like, well, I didn't exactly lay out a plan in there for this, so.
You make the point at some point in the book that Christians are pretty much in the same boat in this marriage market that you describe. Why is that? And is this partially the fault of churches? Right.
Well, a couple things are going on here. First, that there's a lot of Christians in the country, and they make up a good share of the country. And it depends on if you want to slice the pie at church-going Christians or whatnot. But compared to sort of groups like Orthodox Jews and Latter-day Saints, who typically have separate mating markets, right? That function fairly efficiently, although I know that LDS is a little bit anxious about some of the same trends they're seeing in their own. Christians don't really occupy a separate mating market apart from the grander one. So you see evangelicals, at least, marrying about a year and a half later on average. But as that average age at marriage rises, I think it's 27 for women, 29 for men. And if we track in any way towards Europe, it will be in the low 30s here in a decade or so. I don't see why that won't happen to Christians, because they don't consider themselves as part of a distinctive mating market. They overlap entirely with the general population in this sense. So until I see evidence of that not happening, I don't see what I predict changing.
Two things that Ryan mentioned in his intro we haven't talked about, pornography and online dating.
Yeah.
First of all, what's your beef with online dating? Because it has been used for good.
Catherine, I have no beef with online dating. What I talk about in the book is that online dating, in its the way that it functions, and it doesn't matter whether it's eHarmony or Tinder. I mean, its underlying premise is you can do this more efficiently than just sort of letting social things happen around you. So its baseline operating mechanisms aren't any different, whether they have the best of intentions, eHarmony, I guess, or less than the best intentions. At the same time, we also know that these are for-profit companies who want to stay in business, and they have no good business getting you out of the mating market, right? So they're invested in you continually cycling. So there's that. So I know it can be used for good, and I know people who have met online and fall in love and get married. That's great. Like, they have capitalized somehow on it in order to accomplish their intentions, even though the underlying logic of the thing is conducive to the hookup mentality. It's conducive to seeing persons as sexual objects, at least men seeing women as sexual objects. No matter how you sugarcoat it, I mean, I've heard plenty of anecdotal data from people who are on like Catholic Match or who have said, this did not work out like I thought it would. I mean, people are as duplicitous on it as they are on Tinder, perhaps. So I don't have any beef with it per se. It's just its logic is conducive to the same cheapening sex and making people into objects. So pornography is, I look at it from a social standpoint, not a personal standpoint. Most people can't get past this sort of, it's the personal usage of the person I'm with or something that really bothers me. And I get that, and I'm not downplaying that. But I'm interested in how does it affect the mating market in general. And what it does is, it too is, unlike, say, in the 40s, the old Playboy pinup, that was kind of a sexual object, right? Pinned on the wall of your grandfather's garage or something. But today it's very, very different, right? It's far closer to participating in an actual sexual event than that ever was, right? So it more closely mimics sex than ever before. So therefore it means it's creating competition, right? And this is why women say, I can never compete with this. And they're using the right language, right? Competition, because it is that, and what does competition do? It drives down the price of sex, access to which, real sex, she controls, okay? So, she feels then, like, what am I supposed to do, compete with this? She gets upset with a particular person, right? I get that. She thinks, oh, should I, leave this person? And then, so she pulls out of this market, right? Well, in the background here is like, I like marriage. I think marriage is good for American society and Western society and global society. And so anything that really kind of draws that down, right, and makes marriage rates plummet, et cetera, I think is problematic and sad, right? Even if it's rational, right? So she decides to leave for greener grass only to find that it may not exist, right? So I call that in the book the pornographic double bind. Frustrated with the problem that you're dealing with, not sure if you can get away from it in the future with somebody else. So extensive are the pornographic use patterns in the country. So pornography is, in some ways, the cheapest sex. So some people would criticize this book and say, oh, you're just complaining about women being easier. What I'm talking about is forms of easier sexual access, pornography and masturbation being one of those, right? So that's my beef with pornography. I don't really have a problem with online dating, except that it's at some level irreformable. You try to use it for what it can do, but it really essentially makes more efficient the mate searching process. That can be used for good. It can be used in other ways.
When you were talking about some of the sites, it dawned on me that I'm shocked that Amazon hasn't gotten involved in online dating. Somehow they've taken over
Just
everything
wait.
else. But well, that's your point about being part of the marketplace. So
I do wonder, like, when we'll get to this point where commercial sex kind of rolls back into the mainstream, and I think you'll notice it, and I haven't seen it yet, like when mainstream advertisers push the boundary on sexual content, right? Usually sexual content is not inhabited by mainstream advertisers. Once you start to see that happen, we'll be getting close.
That's a far cry from something I'm about to bring up, which Jonah Goldberg, for years, my colleague, has had a thing against K jewelers because of their slogan, "Every kiss begins with K." And it's actually like the most feminist position I've ever heard from Jonah Goldberg, because his argument is you're sort of prostituting women by saying, you need to buy them a ring but anyway.
So
part of
his beef is what?
We should call Jonah. We should call Jonah.
I mean, rings served a purpose historically. They don't really serve that purpose anymore, but people still want it. It reminds me of, like, there's the thing I talk about in the book called cultural lag. It's a sociological term. When the technologies alter the need for something, but that need, the desire for the thing has not disappeared. It just doesn't go away overnight. So, like, prior to the uptake of contraception, and even then, before that, prior to the Industrial Revolution, marriage was almost necessary, right, in order to survive. Not entirely so, but you had to make other arrangements. I mean, you weren't going to be a lone woman on the frontier, we'll say that. And if you were a woman in the city, you were probably going to live with your parents if you were unmarried. So marriage was necessary. But then now it's not really so necessary. The pill comes along, affords many women time for career, education, etc. And it diminishes their need for marriage, but doesn't diminish their desire for marriage. But there's this cultural lag period between the time when the technology comes online or is uptaken and the time when the norms catch up with what it enables. And I think we're getting there, right? I mean, there's this graph in chapter 5 where you look at the share of unmarried 25 to 34-year-olds, and it's climbing, surging, and the share of married 25 to 34-year-olds is declining rapidly over the course of 15 years. And when I look at that, I think, wow, I think the cultural lag is about up, right? People are starting to think, why do people marry, right? They kind of have this tacit desire to, but the circumstances that typically would bring about the need for it are no longer present. Just the sheer desire for it is present. So back to the piece of jewelry, right? Men would give this as a resource, as a sort of a signal of their commitment, right? So this is very much still alive today. Scott Stanley, University of Denver psychologist, says men and women commit differently than men commit differently than women. Not necessarily faster or slower, but just differently when he sacrifices for a woman in terms of going out of his way to do nice things for her. It is a signal from him that he thinks you're the one, right? I'm still used to hearing, women doing all the sacrificing in a lot of accounts. Or like, oh, he wants to see me. I'll get in the car and drive half an hour to see him, right? She's making the sacrifices, in part because if she's in that commitment part of the mating market, she knows that she has competition, okay? And so if she has competition, then she's got to do the work for this, right? Rather than men thinking, I've got competition, I've got to do the work for this. So I was reading some blog where like they had talked about these old films where men were competing for a woman's attention. Like, I never hear about men competing for women's attention anymore, right? I hear them going after a particular woman, but I never hear of competition in the way that we might have once imagined it. So again, back to the ring thing. This is a symbol of sacrifice, right? Many hundreds or many thousands of dollars, sort of saying, I'm in this for good, right? And it made more sense, of course, in an era when she didn't have her own resources, right? And this was a promise, right? This was something worth money, right? So then you get into this, today when people break up engagements, well, what do you do with the engagement ring if there was one? Or if there's not one, people always wonder, seriously, you said yes, and he didn't give you nothing? I mean, there's a reaction to that is sensible, but a little old-fashioned. But then when you think, okay, so he gave her a ring, and then who broke it up? If she broke it up, the logic is that she gives it back to him because this was his gift to her, his promise, right? But if he breaks it up, it's hers, really. I mean, it should be because she didn't do the breaking. He has no right to reclaim something that he gave her. That is of value, right? Because that's what men do. They make promises, they make sacrifices, and they give women resources in exchange for love and romance and sex.
So what you're just describing there in terms of men and sacrifice and these commitments, and is that something that still exists? Is that
Right.
hearkening back to another
Right.
another time?
No, I think it still does exist in some ways. We still, the mating market is still full of exchanges, right? So I think of Nancy Jo Sales' piece in Vanity Fair, which got a lot of attention a couple years ago. Full of economic language, really. It was about Tinder is Tinder killing dating, and Tinder pushed back against it as best they could. What do you know? He is thinking about how much can he acquire for how little, right? So will dinner get me into bed with her, so to speak, right? So it is still about economics, right? It's just far less investment than in the past for the majority of men. Now, there are plenty of men who push back, saying, oh, no, this only works for the elite of men, right? The vast majority of us, more homely fellows, we get nothing. We get no action whatsoever. I think that's not a good way of thinking about it, in part because cheap sex isn't just a real person anymore, right? There is some share of the male population that was maybe arguably not so marriageable to begin with, but now with pornography, like, I don't really need I don't really need a real woman, or if I can, I'll pay for one, right? I mean, there's this whole subculture in Silicon Valley where the men are so busy they just pay for sex, so to speak.
There are some men who want to get married and be fathers
there
and
are.
stuff, right?
Absolutely. And there are a lot of them, frankly, right? So how does that happen? Well, it happens more slowly, typically speaking, than it used to. Women shouldn't misinterpret signals, right, of interest. Back to the sort of the competition thing. If women are in the marriage corner of this market, the men outnumber them dramatically. So they could think he's interested in her romantically, relationally, etc. She's got to do more work on discerning whether he's feigning that interest or not. Online dating, I think people get tired of sort of playing games, and they'll say, tired of games, right? I want something real, which indicates they were duped into being over in the sex market, thinking that was on there. This was a gateway to the marriage market, but it turned out not to be. I'm done with that. I'm setting a higher standard bar cost. But there's fewer people marrying today. The marriage rate's gone down. Men are spending more time independent. But then, the market has a sense of karma. It bites some of them men in the rear end. Eventually, they're 40, 45. Oh, I actually want to do this. And you look around and they find the people that I wanted to marry are no longer on the market, and then they realize that they participated in something that made it difficult for them to realize their own wishes at that point.
Well, that's what struck me so much about your book and so many of the interviews that you relay. These are profiles in confusion and people doing things that are self-defeating otherwise. There's a lot of empathy and compassion in your telling of the stories. So people who and then as you say, this desire for marriage, whether or not it's clear what that looks like, if it can even exist. So folks who want to help this situation, who are fans of marriage, think it's civilizational help, and all these things. What can we do with your data?
I think that the biggest accomplishment I'm hoping for is just sort of an elevated visibility of the mating market and its dynamics. I mean, because this thing is invisible. It operates subconsciously or below people's level of consciousness. I mean, if you think about a sex ratio, which is very real, and people have documented its effects, it exists in exists in classrooms where there's more women than men or more men than women. I mean, these things are real, but we're not paying attention to them, okay? It's time to start paying attention to them and seeing what kind of downstream consequences they afford. And if the earlier you see that, I think the smarter or shrewder your own mating market behavior can become. It doesn't mean that it will solve this problem, because I don't see a clear and obvious solution to this. But I do think, don't be blind. Minimally, that's bad news, right? Because people are blindsided by this. They wake up and I talk about people who she said, oh, I wanted to be married by 27. And then she's like, well, okay, no, I think it's going to be 32. Even though she recognizes that her own behavior has sent such strange messages to men that she's been with, right? No commitment required whatsoever to be with me. That I'm not sure, how does she expect to find a very different kind of man than the kind she has been training for the last several years, right? And yet I'm not blaming her. It might sound like I'm blaming her. I blame the system, right? I mean, it's the system that is chewing people up and spitting them out. But then people will blame themselves, like, oh, I screwed this up, or I didn't see this coming, or it's my own. And your family members can blame you. It's like, oh, why don't you try this or that? And it's not their fault, so to speak, although there are ways that they can help things, right? But it's controversial stuff because it leans on the idea. It's not really an idea. It's a truth that men and women are different and they have different interests on average. Not every single one of them, but on average, right?
And that's why the marketplace idea is so important, because people are in these circumstances. Now let's talk about the reality of the circumstances and move from there. When you talk about noticing early on, does that mean, are you signaling to schools here? Is education need to play a bigger role? And is this...
That's not going to happen. I mean,
It's not gonna-
realistically, educators aren't interested in this. I mean, we're training people for careers. We're training people for not needing relationships at all, really. So, and I'm not saying that's inherently a bad thing or that they should do it differently, but this is not something that's, going to make it into high school social science textbooks, I'm sure.
But was there a piece of advice there for maybe religious schools,
the learning?
first of all?
I haven't really given that a whole lot of thought about who should be reading this in conjunction with other people. But I think there is importance to sort of seeing this, especially when you were a late teenager or something like that, or early 20s, to sort of grasp the sense that there is a market in relationships out there, that you are in it, even if you are not actively looking, and that it's the way it operates has changed profoundly, and it may not be in your interests, so to speak. On the other hand, it may be in their interest, right? Like there are plenty of stories, Kevin in the book, right? I mean, he says, "Oh, I only regret not figuring this market stuff out sooner," right? So he says, if you know what a woman wants, don't give it to her, right? And that way you can get whatever you want, okay? "Oh, I only wish I had learned it sooner than I actually did." There's a lot of people like that who are taking advantage of this. I call it a male-dominated mating market. Partly it's because the cartel of women collapsed. And I have a hard time figuring out how the pill didn't really do that. I mean, it's the single most powerful force in collapsing the price of sex, because the pregnancy risk was just gone, right? I mean, largely, if you took it on time. It was a trade-off. They wanted it, right? Married women wanted it. That's who it was created for in the first place. It wasn't going to last in that sort of capacity, but it was a trade-off. And some of the critics of this book, suspect all sorts of malfeasance on my part, or bad faith, or ill desire. But it's just an explanation of what happened, right? And people want to sort of say, no possible unintended bad consequences could have come from this, right? I don't know why in the world a sociologist would feel the need to say that. But clearly it presses up against some sacred stuff.
Well, and things, as you pointed out, right, or that are intensely personal. Speaking of last night on Facebook, when I asked people what I should be asking you, the majority of people I heard from were men and women in their 30s wanting to know, sure. So what do we do differently?
Right. I didn't respond to them because I really don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. And if I did, I'd have been talking about it a long time ago. This is a social problem. It's not a personal problem. It's not like the opioid epidemic, which is kind of both social and personal. It's like this is largely social in nature, and only kind of a social movement would undo it, and I can't conceive of that happening. Now, you might see little micro cartels reforming. I don't see evidence of that. So let me give you an example from the LDS. I don't think they did this on purpose, but I don't know. They send 19-year-old young men away for 2 years. It's like an initiation. It functions this way. It's not necessarily its intention. And they come back having signaled their kind of adult status, a religious status, so to speak. And it signals in some sense marriageability, because I think there are plenty of LDS women who are like, I'm not going to marry a man who hasn't gone on mission, right? So it's a 2-year phenomenon, and it's a social phenomenon, right? It's not just, individual men go and do these things. It's a social phenomenon. Everybody experiences, or not everybody, but most of them experiences at a sort of a peak sexual interest time, right? And it's one way in which you see, I see how this works socially to accomplish particular things. I don't see that, anything like that in common, right? Everybody go in the Peace Corps for 2 years or something like that. We actually talk about this sometimes when there's, war on the horizon, reinstituting a draft, and isn't it good, like the Israeli Defense Force kind of, there's a functionality to everybody having served, and it fosters this social patriotism, etc. I get that, right? And so what you're looking for, I think, or what you're asking for is like, are there some sort of social kind of event that that men or women can participate in that would alter this situation. I don't see it. I mean, I see no evidence of it.
The first example you pointed to, the LDS Church and the mission, does suggest maybe a challenge to churches to create some kind of social.
Yeah, well, the problem is we're split in 1,000 different ways in American and global Christianity, so it's hard for there to be any center. And I actually do talk about this in the book. There's no center to Christianity, so there's very little authority that sticks, right? Whereas you can see that in other religious groups. So you'd have to be church by church basis, and that's just unlikely because they too are in a religious market that's competitive, right? So you raise the bar on your own people in your church, you risk driving them out. So to somebody else. So it's doubtful, right? The best analogy is sort of the arranged marriage situation in India, which is starting to come apart at the seams a little bit. I'm not talking about an arranged marriage system. What I'm saying is it works because it's socially upheld and because divorce is really, circumscribed or proscribed in India still. So people say, oh, can we do this here? I don't, you can't just sort of start a social phenomenon like that, right? So I'm pessimistic about the possibilities.
How do you keep from utter pessimism looking at the numbers that you do?
That presumes that I'm not utterly pessimistic.
You don't seem like you are. There seems to be some sense of hope about you.
Yeah. How do you keep from utter pessimism? That's a good question. Things change, People say, oh, sexual norms evolve. Like, no, they don't evolve, they change. Things change. 100 years from now, this could be quite a different country, different dynamics going on, right? So one of your Facebook commenters last night said, well, what about if marriage recedes so much and childbearing recedes so much that it's only like religious people who are having babies? That's probably not going to happen because, sex is still related to fertility and contraception does fail for people who don't wish for it to fail sometimes. So, and it's also like, if that's a solution, that's like a 300-year solution, right? I mean, these things do not change anytime soon. I have 8 predictions in the back of the book. And I forget if I mentioned this sort of like the higher fertility approach, but I don't think that's that's a long-term horizon thing. And in reality, I don't think it applies here. I mean, fertility among American Christians is higher than secular Americans, but not by inordinate amounts.
Well, we have a few minutes, and I should open this up to the audience. You definitely have a question.
Yes, sir. My name is Kamil, but I'm a big Pakistani spectator. And my question is how much more blame you would give to men in converting this dating business into meat market. Compared to Match.com, eHarmony, they are strict because they don't want to make it lose a market for sex. But do you think that government should give them little tax break because they are following these Judeo-Christian values compared to Match.com? And the other related question is, according to your experience, when you show your 5 or 6 male group, I'm going out with this woman on Match.com, it's very likely one of those men would ask you, did you get lucky I don't know how women interact with each other when they have this kind of situation. But on the other hand, men are less likely to betray each other if they are going after same woman. So my question is that, do you blame more to men that they have converted this mating market into a meat market?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, do I blame them? Given the lack of social pressure to the contrary, that's what men are going to do. It's sad. It's like a hopeless character flaw in men, probably, but it shouldn't surprise you that men try to cheapen the cost of sex. Not every man, but men in general. I mean, who's running these dating sites? I mean, who's running Tinder? Men, right? I mean, correct, right? So they do operate differently. And like, what about tax breaks? That would mean that the government has to get into the privileging marriage business, and I frankly don't see that they're interested in that right now, and haven't been for quite some time. We've decided to take a hands-off approach to people's relationships and call them all the same, even though marriage is the one union that is historically reproductive and carries on society. And so this is why communities and states have long had interest in what goes on in marriages, because it has an interest in continuity. And now we don't really care about our continuity in the same way that we used to. So it's funny how people read my book and think, oh, he's being too harsh on men, he's being too harsh on women. And I don't know if I want to say that balance is out or somehow, but men and women have different interests on average. You should not be surprised at those things. You should not think that, oh, they will act better than they ought, except under pressure. But there is very little pressure for men to act better than they ought, or to act better than they feel like. And until that pressure happens, I'm not sure you're going to see it, right? So it reminds me of what John Garvey did at Catholic U over here when he kind of bucked the trend and said, we're going to go back to single-sex dormitories. Got all sorts of pushback, including from people who I thought should have thanked the man, right? But he recognizes that, oh, if we want an environment where men and women are encouraged to treat each other with respect and recognize the dignity in each other, maybe we should make a social barrier, especially for men, right, to make it a little bit more difficult for them to treat a woman with disrespect, right? Let's limit their access to her dorms in some ways, right? That's what's going on here. I say in the book, it's not as if lovers are prevented from being together. I mean, that's ridiculous. Two people who want to be alone together will find a place, time, okay? This is to prevent people who are in an early stage of relationship development, or even lack thereof, from doing things that one or both of them will eventually regret. One of the kind of unspoken things in the rape culture discussions going on right now is people assume all these rapes are happening in fraternity houses or apartments. They tend to happen in dormitories. And if you have tighter visiting hours, you are going to find less sexual assault. But it's not something we want to, that's not politically palatable, because we cannot bring ourselves to restrict freedom, especially the freedom of women to interact with men in a manner in which they choose, right? But really, you want to, what the real risk here is restricting men's freedom to some extent. I mean, women will benefit from that restriction. But, there's the intelligent, evidence-driven way of doing things, And then there's the ideological way of doing things. And for quite some time now, we're going with ideology, okay? Because that's who's in control of universities.
Well, it's 1 o'clock, and with a plug from my alma mater, Catholic University, I'm going to end the program so that will be my contribution to to the school for the year, to save me some financial support. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Ryan, and the Heritage Foundation for co-hosting this with the National Review Institute, and thank you everyone for being here and joining us online.